was 17 years old back in January of 2022 when she disappeared and was never seen or heard from again. Her family searched for her. Police from multiple agencies searched for her. The FBI searched for her. A team of volunteers even dug for months in the hell of a landfill to search for her. But Zion is gone forever. Her body is never even found. And you will hear that on the very last night of Zion's life, she made a mistake. She placed her trust in the defendant, her step-cousin, who is by all accounts her favorite cousin. But you will see that there was something off about their relationship. In text messages that were unearthed in one of Zion's old phones, you will see that they communicated with each other continuously. When defendant was 23 years old, Zion was 17 years old. They exchanged a lot of text messages that were sexualized, where the defendant shared vivid and graphic details about his sex life with his 17 or 16-year-old cousin. You will see through these messages that he moved closer and closer into her life, and that on January 4th of 2022, he took things a step further. Late that night, he brought Zion over to his house. They were alone. Just the defendant's two young children were asleep upstairs. Zion left the defendant's house that night in the trunk of his car, and he threw her body away in a dumpster like she was a piece of garbage. Now, there were only two people who can say exactly what happened inside of the house that night. One of them is Zion, and she is gone. The other is the defendant, and you will hear that nearly every time he spoke about what happened, his story changed. And although he got rid of Zion's body, you will see that he left behind a trail of digital evidence that is damning and will show you that the circumstances all lead to one and only one explanation for why Zion left his house in the trunk of his car that night, and that's because he murdered her. Now, I want to walk you through everything that you're going to see and hear throughout this case, but first I want to ask you a favor. Because Zion's body was never recovered, this is a case that required a massive investigation. And it's going to require a very meticulous and very detailed presentation over the next couple of weeks to show you the evidence that there is in this case. And so I want to ask you for your patience throughout this process. This case takes us back again to the night of January 4th of 2022. You're going to hear that that night, Zion left her home in East Point. Those closest to her, including her mother and her boyfriend, had the understanding that she was going out that night with the defendant, her cousin. And you're going to see that Zion's last communication with anyone was very early the next morning on January 5th at about 12:59 a.m. when she texted her boyfriend that she was on her way home. But she never came home that night. She never came home the next morning. Her mother became worried. Her boyfriend became worried. Worry turned to panic. And with the understanding that Zion was last with the defendant, naturally they turned to him to ask where she was. And you will hear that the defendant denied that he had been with her that night. He claimed that he had no idea where she was. But you're going to hear that Zion's boyfriend, the young man named Cortez Gonzalez, was perhaps a bit jealous that Zion had been hanging out with her older cousin that night, her older step-cousin. And you're going to hear that Zion had location sharing enabled on her phone with her boyfriend. And you're going to see that on Zion's last night, at 11:24 p.m., Cortez Gonzalez took a screenshot of Zion's phone's location, and it showed that her phone was right near the defendant's house on Greenfield Road in Detroit at 11:24 p.m. You will see that the defendant claimed, oh, she must have been down the street, or perhaps she was using his house as an alibi, he claimed. Now, eventually, the police became involved. And this started as a missing persons investigation. And the investigation started in East Point, where Zion lived, where she was reported as missing. And you're going to hear that her family quickly became frustrated with the progress in the investigation because Zion had run away a couple of times before. And the police knew that. And she had always come back home. And they were frustrated that the investigation wasn't being taken seriously enough. Eventually, the Detroit Police Department became involved. So did the Michigan State Police and the FBI. And you will see ultimately that these agencies collectively unturned every stone that they reasonably could to find Zion throughout this investigation. Now, one of the first things that happened when this was still a missing persons investigation was on January 6th of 2022, the day after Zion was reported missing. And you're going to see that when this was still a missing persons investigation at that time, that 2 Detroit police officers knocked on the defendant's door and they asked him about Zion's whereabouts. This was a friendly encounter because it was still just a missing persons investigation. And you're going to see this encounter was recorded on those officers' body-worn camera. And you will see that during this conversation that the defendant very politely and confidently told those officers that he had not been with Zion the night of January 4th, that he hadn't seen her in close to a year back in May of 2021. And you will hear him exploit the fact that she had run away previously. He's telling those officers she had run away and she was always at some dude's house, he said. Now, eventually the police obtained phone records from both the defendant's phone and from Zion's phone. You see, these phones that we carry around with us on a daily basis, they're constantly interacting with cell towers. And our providers like AT&T or T-Mobile, they keep records of that data. And that data can give investigators a pretty good idea, not a perfect idea, but a pretty good idea of where our phones have been at specific times. And you will see when those records were mapped out, they tell a story. And that story starts at about 10 p.m. the night of January 4th. At around that time, you will see that the defendant's phone was consistent with being in the area of his house on the west side of Detroit on Greenfield Road. At around that same time, at 10:20, Zion's phone was consistent with being on the other side of town in the area of her house in East Point. At that point, the defendant's phone follows a very clear trajectory. It goes from the area of his house on the west side of Detroit directly east to an area in Hazel Park where his girlfriend worked. She worked midnights. And you're going to hear her tell you that he dropped her off that night. And she had no idea that after he dropped her off, that he was going to pick up his 17-year-old cousin and bring her back to the house without her knowing. From Hazel Park, the defendant's phone goes directly to the area of Zion Foster's home in East Point, where you'll see that the phone arrives at approximately 10:42 p.m. And sure enough, you will see ring video footage from across the street from Zion's home, shows that at that time, at around 10:42, a white sedan pulls up near her house. And you're going to hear that the defendant drove a white sedan at that time, a white Acura. Now from there, the defendant's phone followed another clear trajectory. It went from the area of Zion's home back directly west to the area around his home, where he arrived at 11:15. And by 11:15 p.m., you will see that both the defendant's phone and Zion's phone are consistent with being in the same area around the area of the defendant's home. And at that time, at 11:15, you will see that surveillance video from across the street from the defendant's home shows a white sedan in the defendant's driveway, and 2 people get out of the white sedan and approach the defendant's front door. Now, at 1:15 a.m., just less than 2 hours after Zion arrived at the defendant's home, her phone dropped from the cellular network. It means all of the activity ceased. It's like the phone just vanished. Shortly after that, at 1:41 a.m., You're going to see on that video from across the street of the defendant's house that white sedan pulls out of the driveway and then oddly backs all the way into the driveway. It backs all the way to the tail end of the driveway, pretty much away from the view of the street, and it stays there for a few minutes. And then you're going to see, a few minutes later, one person, and one person alone, comes out of the front door, walks over to that car, a light briefly turns on in the car, and the car pulls away from the defendant's house. Now, at that time, the defendant's phone follows another clear trajectory. Starting at 1:48 a.m., the phone leaves the area of the defendant's house, and it goes down to a very specific parking lot in Highland Park, Michigan. And the phone stays there for about 7 minutes. 7 minutes, and then the phone is consistent with going straight back to the defendant's house, where at 2:15 a.m. you'll see that white sedan pull up on video again. Now that parking lot in Highland Park, where the defendant's phone is consistent with going to and staying for a few minutes in the middle of the night shortly after Zion Foster's phone dropped from the network, that parking lot is pretty much empty except for one distinctive characteristic. It has several large dumpsters in it. Dumpsters large enough to fit human remains, and you will in fact hear that the defendant ultimately confessed that he put Zion's body into one of those dumpsters that night. Now, the police eventually obtained the defendant's cell phone to perform something called a forensic extraction, which is where the police can hook up a cell phone and use computer software to take all of the data off the phone for analysis, location data, text messages, images, videos, you name it. Only thing was, on the defendant's phone, there wasn't much there. You're going to see that on January 7th, 2 days after he put Zion Foster's body into a dumpster, and 1 day after he told the police that he had no idea where she was, he did something called a factory reset on his phone. It's a complete wipe of the phone. So just as her body vanished, he made all of the digital evidence of the last night of her life vanish with her. But you will see that the police also obtained the cell phone of the defendant's girlfriend, a woman named Katrina Smith. And on Katrina Smith's phone, messages revealed some of the defendant's communications back and forth with Miss Smith on the night of January 4th that helped fill in some of the gaps of his activities that night. Now you're going to hear that night, while Miss Smith was away at work, while this happened at their home, that she was pregnant, and she was texting the defendant that she wasn't feeling well. And you're going to see that at 1:25 a.m., she texted the defendant, "I think I need to come home." And his response was, "You can make it, baby." This was right after Zion's phone dropped from the network. He didn't agree to come pick his girlfriend up and bring her back from work until after he put his cousin's body in a dumpster. You're going to see that at 2:21 a.m., just minutes after getting home from putting Zion Foster's body in a dumpster, the defendant texted Katrina Smith claiming that their cat scratched his neck. He claimed that he was trying to tickle the cat, and the cat, quote unquote, beat his ass. Now, you're going to hear that the police also obtained some records from the defendant's Google account that were stored in the cloud and separate from his phone that was wiped. And you're going to see that on January 6th, at around 2 in the afternoon, just before the defendant told those Detroit police officers he hadn't seen Zion Foster in close to a year, his phone was consistent with returning back to the area of those dumpsters, back to the parking lot. Now, by then, the dumpster had already been empty, and Zion's body would have been long gone. But you will see that just after leaving that area, that the Google search history recovered directly from Google shows that he Googled the following phrases: "Are trash trucks also compactors? And what is the force of a garbage truck compactor?" Now, January 19th, 2 weeks later, was a significant day for the investigation. Up until that point, a search of the defendant's home had not revealed any evidence, but that day the police also searched the defendant's car, that white sedan, that white Acura. And you will hear that to search the defendant's car, the police used something called a cadaver dog, which is a dog that is specially trained to detect the odor of human remains. And you're going to hear that when that dog searched through the defendant's car, the dog indicated that it detected the odor of human remains in 2 different areas of the trunk of the defendant's car. You're also going to hear that that same day, January 19th, the defendant came into the Detroit Police Department voluntarily and turned himself in. And he made a statement, he agreed to make a statement in front of the police with a lawyer that he had at that time, who's now deceased, a man by the name of Gary Jones. Now, recall that before that day, before January 19th, the defendant's claims had primarily been that he had no idea where Zion was, he wasn't with her that night that she disappeared, and had no idea what was going on. This day, January 19th, he gave a different version. He said, after all, he was with her that night. He brought her back to his house late at night, and they smoked some marijuana. Only he claimed that after smoking marijuana, that she just oddly died for no apparent reason in his presence. And that his reaction, you will hear him calmly and confidently say, was not to call 911, but to put her body in the trunk of his car and dispose of her remains. The very next day, you're going to hear that he sat down with another investigator and gave another statement and another version of what happened. This time he said they actually used LSD together, and that must have been what killed her. After making those statements, you're going to hear that the defendant got onto recorded phone lines from jail and immediately distanced himself from those statements, essentially claiming that he said what he said because his lawyer told him to turn the heat down on the investigation. Well, it didn't work. You're going to hear that at around this time, the defendant was charged in Macomb County for lying to the police for some of the statements he had made to an East Point detective in connection with Zion's disappearance. And he was ultimately sentenced to a brief term of prison while the murder investigation proceeded. While the murder investigation proceeded, on June 10th of 2022, 2 investigators sat down and took another statement with the defendant, and he gave another version of what happened. This time he said that whole LSD thing, that was a lie that he made up. It's as though every time he spoke, he tried to erase what he had said about this before. And in fact, you will hear that recently he placed a call that's recorded in which he asked his girlfriend to research the pros and cons of recanting a statement in a criminal case. Now, equipped with these claims that the defendant made that Zion somehow suddenly died in his presence, the police wanted to investigate the medical plausibility of that claim. And so they obtained Zion's medical records from Henry Ford Health System and got about 630 pages of records dating back to 2016 when Zion was just a little girl. And you're going to hear that an assistant medical examiner with Wayne County by the name of Dr. Lee Labadie, who's a forensic pathologist who's trained to determine the cause and manner of death. She analyzed Zion's medical records. She also analyzed them in reference to the defendant's claims that he made about the supposed spontaneous circumstances of Zion's passing. And you're going to hear a couple of key things in her testimony. Number one is that Zion had no documented history of any medical condition that would explain her suddenly passing away the way that the defendant described. Number two, you're going to hear that people don't die from marijuana overdoses, and people don't die from LSD overdoses. And you will hear Dr. Labadie explain that nothing in the way that the defendant described of Zion's passing was consistent with any other type of drug overdose death. Number three, you're going to hear that Zion's boyfriend, Vertez Gonzalez, will tell you that at one point he saw Zion have what he understood was a brief seizure, where he describes that she passed out for a few seconds and then came right back to it. Dr. Labadie will tell you that in all of Zion's medical records, that there is no indication that Zion was ever diagnosed with a seizure disorder, that she suffered from any symptoms of seizures, and she will tell you that the way that the defendant described her sudden passing was not consistent with the seizure. And Dr. Labadie will further tell you that even if it was, in all the thousands of cases that she's worked on, she's never seen an otherwise healthy teenager die from a seizure. But she has seen plenty of people die from violence. And the bottom line is that she will opine that there is no medical plausibility to the description that the defendant gave of how Zion supposedly died in his presence without any intervention on his part. Now, if Zion's body had been recovered, these questions could have been answered. Even if her body was recovered long after he put her in a dumpster. Was she choked? Was she raped? Did she die somehow of some inexplicable natural cause? So the search for Zion's body became paramount in the investigation. And you're going to hear how the police meticulously traced they tried to identify the garbage truck that first dumped the specific dumpster that Zion's body was believed to have been put in. They traced that truck using video to something called a transfer station, where garbage is briefly dumped before being compiled and hauled off to a landfill. They tried to identify, using more video, the specific semi-truck that would have hauled off the contents of that specific dumpster, and they traced that all the way to a landfill, to a specific area. And you're going to hear that a team of volunteers dug in that area. They dug for months and months and months trying to find Zion's remains. Unfortunately, they didn't find her. You're going to hear that this was publicly reported. The media covered this landfill search that was going on. And while this landfill search was winding down in the fall of 2022, you're going to see that while the defendant was finishing up his prison term at that time for the Macomb County case, that he had a flurry of communications with his girlfriend, Katrina Smith. Some of those communications were over a recorded phone line from the prison. Some of those communications were over a phone that he had hidden in his prison cell that he was using to text his girlfriend with. And you're going to see not once in those communications does the defendant express hope that Zion's body is recovered by the police. Instead, you will see that at one point he sent his girlfriend a link to this article entitled, "If I'm a Suspect in a Murder but a Body is Never Found, Can I Be Charged?" You're going to see that after he sent that link to her, he followed up with a message saying, "I know, baby, and it's okay. I may plan out every step, so relax. And the attachment I just sent is the main one." And he followed that up by saying, "There is nothing to worry about." Well, he was wrong. You don't get away with murder just by getting rid of a body. And as a result of all of this, the defendant stands charged with second-degree murder, and he stands charged with tampering with evidence. And at the conclusion of this case, I'm going to ask that you find that based on all of the circumstances in this case, there is no innocent explanation for him putting Zion Foster's body into a dumpster in the middle of the night after bringing her to his house alone in the middle of the night, after months of sexualized text messages, and before a campaign of obstruction to make all of the evidence of that night disappear, including lie after lie after lie. I'm going to ask that at the end of this case, you tell him what the truth is by delivering a verdict that says that he's guilty. Thank you.